Hello Channel NITT viewers, I'm DS, a psychologist, and welcome to another episode on Channel NITT. In this episode, we're going to try something that we have never attempted before. Why not? Since we have already moved into Season 6. In this episode, we're going to explain the China-US tension and state of affairs from the MBTI point of view. In order for us to start, we will first have to personify the two giants and assign them their MBTI type. Let's start with China. So although both the US and China may be behaving in very childish ways and impish ways, which warrants both countries to be typed as the XXXP type or the P type in short. However, if you analyze China very carefully, you will realize that China is doing what she is doing almost as if she has no choice. So the tit for tat strategy that China is adopting is almost as if this is the only way in which she can do to preserve the national integrity. So any country in her position would have done similar. Conversely, it is the US that seems to be the active agonist. So based on my observation of China and America, I would first assign China to be an ISTJ. So characteristics that will be used to describe the ISTJ that I would also use to describe China would include traditional, careful, concerned with rules, dogmatic, inflexible, and stubborn. On the other hand, the US is best typed as the ESTP. So America has very successfully branded herself as outgoing, persuasive, action-oriented, and in a position of good leadership. However, if you read about the US economy quite deeply, you will know that actually the US is very unstructured. So US may be undergoing an economic recession at the moment. This is because for a long time they have only been focusing on the present. So the US have been focusing only on immediate present rather than long-term plans, and they have not really cared about long-term economic consequences. So this kind of a behavior is very typical of the ESTP as well. So just now, as we have mentioned, if we do take a bird's eye view and analyze China and US very objectively, we will realize that a lot of the times when China has a stand on something like, for example, Taiwan or their stand on de-dollarization, it is almost a Hobson's choice. So regardless of whether that is the right thing to do, that seems to be the only thing that they can do. That seems to be logical and credible. But nonetheless, the rest of the world will tend not to see this. They will want to see China very negatively. So in this war between China and US, China is definitely disadvantaged from the global sentiments point of view. Most of the rest of the world tend to support US. Why? Let's look at it from the MBTI point of view. The first thing that comes immediately to mind is that the ISTJ is actually a very unpopular MBTI type. And China happens to be personified as the ISTJ. Imagine you go for a class and there's a lecture. The ESTP is annoying because he keeps asking questions. Professor, why do you say this? Why can't it be this? So he disturbs the class. But the ISTJ can be even more annoying because the ISTJ tends to hold up the entire lecture at the end of the class by asking questions. Because the ISTJ is an introvert, so they tend to keep the questions and then they want to ask because they are curious, but they do not ask immediately or on that point. They are a little bit passive in that sense. So when they start to ask questions only right at the back where everybody wants to go home, it is actually more annoying. If both of these classmates are just as annoying, would you have preferred the ISTJ classmate or the ESTP classmate? The second peculiar disadvantage of being the ISTJ is that traditionally, the I types gave people the impression of femininity, and the E types, the extrovert, gave people the impression of masculinity. This is also apparent in the tarot system. So we have actually discussed this long ago. The introverts are represented by the queens, while the extroverts are represented by the kings and knights. And the kings and the knights are typically the male characters in the tarot system. So why would this be a disadvantage? Because in Asia especially, there is this tendency to slant towards favoring the males. In many Asian cultures, the male is definitely preferred to the female. Many families would rather have a son than a daughter. So in a very strange way, when you have to choose between a male and a female, most of the time, the male is chosen in the Asian context. And China is in Asia, and so are other Asian countries that are not in the picture of the conflict between US and China. And in a very funny way, even those people in Asia are not supporting China. So how can China not be in a disadvantaged position? Lastly, in a world whereby we actually promote consumerism so much, SE is the main thing. So if you have to compare, SE is going to be definitely more popular than SI. Hence, ESTPs are going to be more favored as compared to the ISTJ. On top of that, the ESTP has another advantage over the ISTJ, and that is ESTP tends to be viewed more heroically than the ISTJ. So if we want to identify which one is the hero, we tend to label the one with the SE inclination or SE DOMs as a hero if we have to force one to be a hero. So naturally, the other one becomes the villain if they have to come head to head. So in this case, the China is almost always viewed as a villain, even though they have no choice but to take up their position. I'm not too sure about other channels, but I think that we may be one of the first channels to discuss the China-US conflict based on MBTI analysis. How do you find this episode? Do comment and share with us. So if you have enjoyed this video, do give us a like. Further down the road, we will be producing a lot more videos that are unconventional and interesting, just like the ENTJ and the ISTJ. No, the INTJ. Of course, if you have not subscribed, do consider subscribing so that we can bring you more MBTI and fun stuff. Okay, I'm going to sign off now, and I'll see you in our next episode. Bye bye.